The camera doesn't need to be inside a courtroom to understand what's happening. You just need to follow the documents. Court filings from 3 continents, government commission transcripts running into thousands of pages, internal organizational memos that were never supposed to see the light of day, testimonies from survivors who waited decades to be heard. This is not a story about belief. This is a story about accountability. And in 2026, one of the most legally shielded religious organizations in the modern world is discovering, for the first time in its history, that the shield has cracks. What you're about to watch is an investigation into 5 converging forces that are turning 2026 into what may be remembered as the year the Watchtower's carefully constructed wall began to crumble from the inside. If this kind of investigative content matters to you, and I think it does, hit the like button right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it tells the algorithm this conversation deserves to be heard. Now let's get into it. The architecture of control. For more than a century, the organization formerly known as the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania has operated with a discipline that most institutions would envy and most critics would call something else entirely. It built its infrastructure quietly. A global network of congregations, called Kingdom Halls, spread across more than 240 countries and territories. A publishing operation that, at its peak, distributed more literature than almost any other organization on Earth. A hierarchical structure centered at its world headquarters in Warwick, New York, where a small governing body of men issues doctrinal directives treated by millions of followers as the literal voice of God. The organization's financial holdings, largely tax-exempt, have been estimated by investigative journalists and legal analysts at over $1 billion in real estate alone. It owns printing facilities, farms, residential complexes, and legal entities structured across multiple jurisdictions in ways that have historically made financial transparency nearly impossible to demand from the outside. For decades, this structure worked exactly as designed. Abuse allegations were handled internally, dissenters were shunned, critics were dismissed as apostates. Governments, by and large, treated the organization with the same deference afforded to any established religion. But something shifted. Not overnight. Not because of a single scandal or a single courtroom, but because of something slower, more systemic, and ultimately more difficult to stop. The gradual, irreversible convergence of legal scrutiny, digital transparency, and cultural change. And in 2026, those forces have reached a pressure point. Point 1. The new language of legal accountability. There is a term that has quietly transformed how governments engage with religious institutions over the last 15 years. That term is institutional responsibility. It used to be that religious organizations operated under an implicit legal assumption that what happened inside a congregation was a matter of faith, not law. That internal discipline, internal records, and internal decisions were protected behind a wall of religious freedom that courts were reluctant to pierce. That assumption is no longer safe. In Norway, the government has moved to revoke state subsidies from Jehovah's Witnesses, citing the organization's practice of shunning, the formal, socially enforced exclusion of members who leave or are expelled, as a violation of human rights law. Norwegian authorities specifically identified the policy of shunning as a mechanism that coerces members into remaining in the organization against their will, and as a form of psychological harm leveled particularly at minors. The withdrawal of subsidies was not a symbolic gesture. It was a legal determination that the organization's internal practices had crossed a threshold that democratic law could not ignore. That decision sent a signal that reverberated well beyond Scandinavia. It told legal advocates in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Germany, in Canada, and in Australia that the religious freedom argument, long the organization's most reliable legal shield, was no longer automatically dispositive. That courts and regulatory bodies were now willing to look at what actually happens inside these institutions. Not just what they claim to believe, but what they demonstrably do. The consequences of that shift are still unfolding. In the United States, civil litigation against the Organization for Child Sexual Abuse has accelerated dramatically. Attorneys who represent survivors describe a legal environment in 2026 that is fundamentally different from what existed even 5 years ago. Discovery motions that were once denied on religious privilege grounds are being granted. Internal elder correspondence, letters documenting abuse reports, congregation-level decisions about whether to involve police, instructions from branch offices on how to handle allegations, is reaching courtrooms. What those documents reveal is systematic. And in case after case, juries have agreed. The monetary judgments being rendered against the organization are not small. They run into the tens of millions of dollars per case in some jurisdictions. And the organization's legal strategy, which historically emphasized aggressive appeals and prolonged litigation designed to exhaust plaintiffs financially, is increasingly failing against legal teams funded by survivor advocacy organizations with both the resources and the patience to match them. This is the first converging force. And by itself, it would be enough to characterize 2026 as a difficult year. But it doesn't stop here. Point 2. The long shadow of case study. 29. In 2015, the Australian Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse published what would become one of the most detailed and damning public examinations of a religious organization's handling of abuse ever recorded. Case Study 29 examined the Jehovah's Witnesses specifically. What the Commission found, over the course of hearings that included the testimony of organization elders, branch officials, and survivors, was not merely that individual predators had operated within congregations. What it found was that the organization's own internal judicial system had functioned, for decades, as a mechanism for concealing those predators from law enforcement and from the broader public. The Commission identified over 1,000 individuals within the Australian branch alone who had been reported to the organization for child sexual abuse, but whose cases had never been referred to police. 1,000 cases, over a span of decades. Many of those individuals remained active within their congregations. Some were given positions of authority. The organization's representatives, testifying before the Commission, defended the practices by citing Scripture. Specifically, the biblical principle that requires 2 witnesses to establish wrongdoing. In cases of child sexual abuse, which virtually never produce a second witness, that standard functioned as a near absolute bar to any internal accountability. The Commission rejected that defense entirely. Now, here is what matters about 2026. The Royal Commission completed its public hearings years ago, but its work did not end there. The findings fed directly into legislative reform in Australia. They informed the legal strategies of survivor advocates in other countries. They produced a body of documented evidence about organizational knowledge and organizational policy that has become foundational to civil litigation on multiple continents. In 2026, Case Study 29 is not history, it is precedent. It is a roadmap. It is evidence entered into courtrooms in jurisdictions that were never part of the original Australian proceeding. The Commission's work proved that the internal behavior of this organization, when subjected to rigorous, independent scrutiny, could not withstand examination. That proof has become a permanent part of the legal and investigative infrastructure surrounding the Watchtower. And in 2026, that infrastructure is being used. Point 3. The digital collapse of information control. There is a version of this story that could only have existed before the internet, a version where internal documents stayed internal, where a disfellowshipped member's testimony reached, at most, a handful of people willing to listen, where the organization's narrative, that critics are spiritually motivated apostates, that abuse claims are exaggerated, that institutional policies are dictated by God, could be repeated loudly enough to drown out the counter-narrative. That version ended. In 2026, the mechanisms of information control that the organization once relied upon have been comprehensively dismantled by the digital environment, not by any single actor, not by any deliberate campaign, but by the cumulative weight of thousands of individuals making individual choices to share what they know. Former members, many of whom left the organization decades ago after being shunned, after reporting abuse that went unaddressed, after raising doctrinal questions that were met with ecclesiastical punishment, have built a documentary record online that is now indexed, searchable, and globally accessible. Organizational letters sent from branch offices to congregation elders, training materials for judicial committees, internal guidance documents about how to handle media inquiries, how to respond to legal subpoenas, how to interact with members who are asking difficult questions. These documents are real. They have been authenticated in court proceedings. They circulate on documentary platforms, on forums, on YouTube channels with subscriber counts in the hundreds of thousands. The survivor community, once atomized, isolated by geography, by shunning, by the psychological weight of leaving a high-control religious environment, has coalesced around digital spaces that provide both information and community. Former members who spent years believing they were uniquely flawed, uniquely faithless, uniquely responsible for their own expulsion, have discovered that their experiences were not unique at all. They were systemic. That discovery, made possible only by digital connection, has been transformative. It has converted private grief into public testimony. It has connected potential plaintiffs with attorneys. It has provided journalists and documentary filmmakers with sources, documents, and context that would have been inaccessible a generation ago. The organization understands this. Its response has been to intensify warnings to current members about the dangers of internet research, to characterize ex-member communities as spiritually contaminated, and to reinforce the doctrinal framework that treats outside information as inherently suspect. Those efforts have had diminishing returns, particularly among younger members, for whom information restriction has become a flag rather than a fence. Point 4. The quiet crisis inside the walls. Not all of the pressure on this organization comes from outside. There is a phenomenon that sociologists who study high-control religious groups have documented with increasing precision over the last decade. They call it deconversion cascading. The process by which the departure of one member, particularly a young, visible, or long-tenured member, creates a permission structure for others to examine doubts they had been suppressing. The Jehovah's Witnesses operate within an extraordinarily effective social control system. The practice of disfellowshipping, which requires current members to cut off all social contact with those who leave or are expelled, functions as a powerful deterrent against departure. For many members, the organization is not merely a religious affiliation. It is the totality of their social world. To leave is to lose family, friends, community, and, within the organization's theological framework, the prospect of eternal survival. That deterrent has not disappeared, but evidence suggests it is weakening. In 2026, trends observable across multiple data points, membership statistics from countries that require religious organizations to report numbers publicly, survey data from former member communities, the observable growth of ex-member support organizations, suggest that the rate of internal questioning has accelerated significantly over the last 5 years. This is not a story of open rebellion. Active, organized internal dissent is nearly impossible within a group whose response to any expression of doubt is immediate judicial action. What is happening instead is quieter. Members conducting private research on devices the organization does not control. Young people delaying baptism, the formal commitment that makes disfellowshipping possible, or declining it entirely. Long-standing members going through the outward motions of participation while privately disengaging from the doctrinal framework. The organization has no word for this phenomenon, because to name it would be to acknowledge it. But it is real, and its long-term implications for institutional vitality are significant. An organization that depends on the committed labor of volunteers, who build its halls, conduct its door-to-door ministry, staff its conventions, and fund its operations through donations, faces existential pressure when the quality of that commitment erodes. The hours invested in ministry activities, the donations given, the buildings maintained. These are not abstract metrics. They are the material substrate of an organization that, unlike most religious institutions, does not employ a professional clergy and has no external revenue stream. Point 5. The restructuring paradox. In 2016, the organization undertook what it described to members as a spirit-directed reorganization of its global structure. Dozens of branch facilities around the world were consolidated or closed. Thousands of volunteers were relocated. Printing operations that had been the organization's flagship activity for over a century were dramatically scaled back. Circuit and district conventions were downsized. Bethel families, the live-in volunteers who staff organizational headquarters and branch offices, were reduced in number and asked, in many cases, to return to local congregations. The organization framed these changes as evidence of mature, responsive leadership adapting to a new era of digital ministry. Critics, and a growing number of researchers who study new religious movements, read the same events differently. When a large, asset-rich institution begins liquidating physical infrastructure, reducing its workforce, consolidating decision-making authority, and shifting its operational model away from the labor-intensive practices that defined it for a century, the most parsimonious explanation is not strategic vision, it is financial pressure. By 2026, those structural changes have continued. The sale of Kingdom Hall properties, coordinated through a congregation-level loan and deed arrangement that effectively gives organizational headquarters control over real estate nominally owned by local congregations, has generated significant cash flow. But it has also generated litigation, as former congregation members have challenged arrangements they describe as coercive. And as courts have begun examining whether the organizational control over local property constitutes a legal relationship that carries liability. The paradox at the center of this restructuring is this: every change designed to insulate the organization from financial and legal exposure has created new exposure. Centralizing property control makes the organization more efficient, but also more legally accountable as a single entity. Reducing physical presence eliminates overhead, but also eliminates community infrastructure that bound members to local congregations. Shifting to digital platforms accelerates communication, but also accelerates the spread of exactly the information the organization needs its members not to see. Let me be precise about what 2026 is and what it is not. It is not the end of the Jehovah's Witnesses. The organization has 8 to 9 million members worldwide. It has operated continuously for over a century. It has survived doctrinal embarrassments, organizational scandals, and legal challenges before. It will not dissolve because of a difficult year. But 2026 may be remembered as something more specific and more important than an ending. It may be remembered as the year of convergence. The year in which 5 distinct lines of pressure, legal, historical, digital, internal, and structural, stopped operating independently and began reinforcing one another in ways that have no obvious resolution. When governments reclassify your practices as human rights violations, that is not a manageable news cycle. When a royal commission's findings become the evidentiary foundation for a decade of civil litigation, that is not a temporary legal exposure. When the digital environment permanently eliminates your capacity to control the information your members can access, that is not a problem that a new media strategy will solve. When the generation raised within your organization demonstrates measurably less commitment to its demands, that is not a retention challenge that better programming will reverse. And when the structural changes you implement to survive create new legal vulnerabilities faster than they eliminate old ones, that is not an adaptation. That is a trap. The institutions that have collapsed throughout history, religious, governmental, corporate, rarely collapsed in a single dramatic moment. They collapsed through the accumulation of unresolved pressures that eventually exceeded the system's capacity to absorb them. The Watchtower has not reached that point. But in 2026, for perhaps the first time in its history, a credible argument can be made that it is moving toward it. The documents exist. The survivors have spoken. The courts are listening. The only question that remains is how long institutional inertia can hold against the weight of what is now known. If you made it this far, you understand why this story matters, not because of religion, but because institutional accountability, the principle that no organization, regardless of its claims to divine authority, is above the obligation to answer for harm done to real people, is a principle worth defending. Leave a comment below. Tell me which of these 5 points you think carries the most weight. Tell me what I missed. Tell me what you want to see investigated next. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share this with someone who needs to understand what's happening, and I'll see you in the next one.